Bayou Sainte-Claire, southern United States. While the neighbors busily reinforced wooden doors and stacked sandbags for the flood season as they had done for years, a quiet boat repairman began building something they had never seen. He drove rows of cypress stakes into a deflecting wall in front of his house, leaving deliberate gaps for water to pass through, and tied netting to catch drifting debris. The neighbors called it a broken fence. They called him eccentric. They said that to fight floods you had to build dikes, seal everything tight, make thick walls. That was the right way. The way anyone living beside a bayou knew. But he kept building, measuring each gap, adjusting each tie, extending the baffle wall a few more feet even as they shook their heads in exasperation. Then that year's rainy season arrived earlier than any forecast. The water rose and the fierce current tore away steps, eroded foundations, toppled the houses that seemed the sturdiest in just hours. In the homes prepared the usual way, floors collapsed in sections, large debris punched through walls, children were trapped as water rose too fast. But the boat repairman's house, with the baffle wall they considered ridiculous, withstood wave after wave of impacts and swirling currents. The water behind it remained slower, the foundation stayed intact, and the people sheltering inside remained safe. What had he understood about flow, water force, and how it dissipates that everyone else dismissed as foolish excess? If you love stories of practical wisdom proven by real trials, remember to subscribe. We have many more documented accounts worth reflecting on. That boat repairman had lived his whole life beside the bayou, with a hammer, a few ropes, and ideas about water that his neighbors spent months mocking. Caleb Rourke grew up on the edge of Bayou Sainte-Claire, where water never stands still and never flows in a straight line, where small channels weave through reeds, sudden bends curve around old cypress trunks, and seemingly calm areas always carry an underlying force that taught him early that water is not something you can command. His father had built fish traps with sparse rows of stakes, letting water pass but losing strength, and from childhood Caleb clearly saw something many living near the bayou refused to admit. The things that survive floods are rarely those that rigidly block the flow. As he grew up, he apprenticed with boat builders at La Forge Dock, replacing hull planks, reinforcing ribs, patching cracks left by strong currents. And there he learned another lesson, that what destroys is not how high the water surface rises, but the kinetic energy of moving water carrying logs, wood fragments, and relentless repeated pressure. One impact can shake a hull, but hundreds of small consecutive impacts are what crack wood and bend frames. Now building his own wooden house on low ground right at the marsh edge, where upstream water could flood in at any time, Caleb planned to follow what the bayou had taught him his whole life. He repaired pillar bases, replaced weak planks, rebuilt the steps, did everything like the other houses in the area, enough that passing neighbors nodded approvingly and thought he had finished the most important work. They assumed he would move on to familiar flood preparations, but instead of stacking sandbags or building sealed barriers, Caleb began driving cypress stakes into the mud in a curving deflection line in front of the house, not enclosing, not closing a circle, just like an arm extended to meet the flow. He did not place stakes close together, but left regular gaps, wide enough for water to pass, but not to retain full force. From a distance, what he was building looked like an unfinished fence, or an abandoned structure, not tall, not thick, and completely unlike any familiar flood measure. The dock overseer, Earl Duvall, stopped by during a shrimp pond check and asked what exactly Caleb was building. Deflection wall, Caleb said, adjusting a stake to straight, eyes still tracking the water surface for flow direction. Baffle wall, like a fish trap but for the house. Earl spat tobacco into the mud and smirked, saying it was just a fence in front of the house, that good cypress was being wasted and rising water would sweep it away. Others who heard laughed along, saying water had to be diked, blocked, sealed, and anything with gaps was just inviting it in. Caleb did not argue. He kept working, cutting thick diagonal braces, nailing them between stakes so the frame would not shake when pushed, digging shallow trenches at stake bases, then packing mud tight like anchoring trap stakes so current would not hollow underneath. Each gap he gauged by eye and habit, not wide enough for large logs to pass intact, not narrow enough to turn the wall into a solid surface taking full force. News of the weird fence spread quickly through porches and general stores. People stopped to look, shook their heads, and moved on. Caleb's outer barrier was not sealed planks like a levee but a row of upright cypress stakes, rough surface evenly spaced, with shorter offset stakes placed ahead so Flo would stumble before reaching the main row, something that to outsiders looked messy and pointless but to those who understood water was a way to rob Flo of strength through many small collisions rather than one big impact. "Looks like a broken fence," said Nora Belcourt, the teacher at the little church school by the marsh, as she passed one afternoon, but her tone was more curious than mocking, and she stopped to watch the gaps Caleb measured evenly as if setting rhythm for a song. "Not to block," Caleb explained briefly. "To slow it down. Fast water kills. Slow water is just water." He had learned that not only from boats and traps but from scattered stories of lifelong bayou dwellers, from an old Cajun woman's words that keeping reeds along the bank was better than clearing them, because reeds deflect flow and hold mud, to how sparse stake rows in front of shrimp sheds caught drifting logs outside instead of letting them hit main posts. Those things were never written in books but had lasted long enough to prove their worth. While neighbors worried about gathering sandbags and reinforcing doors, Caleb continued perfecting the baffle wall, replacing braces not tight enough, adjusting curves to deflect flow both ways, because he knew a solid wall would become a force-bearing shield, and when force arrived it would either collapse or hollow the ground behind. What he needed was not absolute blocking but controlled slowing. The laughter continued. Earl Duval and others seeing Caleb's work as wasted time and good wood, believing flood defense had only one right way: higher, tighter, heavier. But what they did not understand was that flood is not just rising water but moving water under pressure. Flow force through gaps and finding the easiest path, continuous force striking the same point until whatever stands there loses grip. A deflecting baffle wall with calculated gaps could do what a sealed levee could not: split the flow, force water to change direction, lose energy, and leave behind a slower, calmer area. Those principles were as simple as the bayou had long taught, the materials familiar, and Caleb's measurements, though only by eye and experience, accurate in the way of someone who had watched water his whole life. Before the rainy season truly poured down, and the bayou revealed its unrelenting power, Caleb's broken fence wall was ready to prove that water has its physics, like wind, and that sometimes what helps people stand firm is not stopping nature but understanding how it works. Rain began falling steadily that weekend. Not violent, not roaring, just heavy downpours lasting from morning to night, day after day, enough to change the bayou's color and raise water levels bit by bit without triggering the usual panic of major storms. Bayou Sainte-Claire was used to rain, and locals were used to water rising and receding in its own rhythm, so no one saw those consecutive rainy days as a serious warning. By the third day, water was higher than normal, spilling into side channels and pressing against low foundations, but still not enough to call a flood in the usual sense. Yet the flow had changed. Water was not just higher, it moved faster, carrying black upstream mud and small debris, normally seen only after big rains. In houses with nothing shielding except steps and old support posts, fast water flowed right against walls, wrapping invisible ropes around pillar bases, shifting direction when meeting obstacles, then redirecting force. Drifting debris, branches, planks, plastic bins, struck steps and wooden walkways directly, each hit not strong enough to break instantly, but enough to shake structures and gradually erode mud holding foundations. Overnight, many houses showed small hollows under pillars where mud was swept clean, exposing soaked wood roots, and people waded out, shoveling mud to patch temporarily, believing everything would be fine when water receded. At Caleb Rourke's house, the scene was completely different, even though water level in front was no lower than anyone else's. When the first flow reached the Cypress Baffle wall, it did not stop but also did not charge straight at the foundation like elsewhere. Flow was deflected both sides, stumbling over offset stakes, then splitting into many smaller streams, each losing some force before passing gaps. Drifting debris caught on the outside, held by offset stakes and low braces, piling into a temporary barrier that slowed water behind even more. Behind the baffle wall, water still rose but its movement became quiet, no swirling, no pounding. Upstream mud entered with water, then settled in a fine layer around Caleb's house pillars instead of being swept away. With each rainy day, that mud layer thickened, as if water was building the foundation instead of destroying it. Caleb did nothing but observe, walking along the baffle wall, checking ties, removing large trapped branches to avoid local pressure buildup, and letting the rest handle itself in water's own way. Neighbors passing by saw the scene and only glanced. They saw water in front of Caleb's house as high as theirs, saw him still waiting to get around, and concluded the wall did nothing significant. Some said water was not strong enough yet to test it. Some said if flow shifted a bit, all that debris would push straight into his house. Most thought it was just luck, that this rain was not big enough to prove or disprove anything. When water rose to touch steps of several houses, then stopped there without rising further, attention faded quickly. People were used to water reaching a certain level then receding, and this time was not much different from previous years. Earl Duvall passed along the marsh bank, looked at the cypress stake row in front of Caleb's house with debris piled outside, and smirked faintly, telling his companion that one more day of rain, and that broken fence would become bait for the current. When rain eased and water began slow retreat, other houses revealed eroded foundations, mud swept into winding small channels around pillars, while Caleb's left an even settled mud ring behind the baffle wall, the ground looking even firmer than before. But no one considered it noteworthy. People were busy repairing steps, nailing extra planks, shoveling mud to rebuild foundations, and telling each other that this year's flood was mild, that the bayou was still gentle. The first flood passed like that. Not big enough to cause fear, not clear enough to force anyone to rethink, only enough for a quiet test almost no one noticed, except Caleb, who had seen exactly what he expected, not how much or little water, but how it was forced to move that decided what stands firm after the rain stops. When the rain finally stopped and the bayou began receding in its familiar slow rhythm, leaving behind only mud, debris, and the quiet traces of the flow, Margaret Hines was the first to pause long enough to examine those traces as data rather than just aftermath. Margaret was the teacher at the small school near the church, someone who for years had routinely recorded rainfall and water levels for the parish office, and to her, every dried mud streak or exposed pillar base carried specific meaning. While others busied themselves repairing steps and clearing trash, Margaret carried a notebook, measuring tape, and a few thin wooden stakes, wading to the water's edge in her mud-seasoned boots. She placed stakes to measure water levels at 3 points around Caleb Rourke's house, one in front of the Cypress Baffle wall, where the flow had struck during the rainy days, one right behind the baffle where the water had slowed, and a third close to the house foundation, the spot most people used to gauge danger. Margaret marked the highest water lines still visible on the stakes, noted the relative heights between points, then lightly stirred the mud around the stake bases with her foot to feel the degree of erosion. She did not just record how high the water rose, but also signs of flow, swirl marks, and foundation stability after the water retreated. The numbers emerged clearer than any page in her notebook. In front of the baffle wall, peak water height was not significantly different from other houses, but the mud foundation was heavily disturbed, leaving small channels from constant redirection. Behind the baffle, water level was only a few inches lower, not enough for the naked eye to notice, but flow was markedly weaker, almost no swirls, and the settled mud formed a smooth, even surface thicker than before the rain. At Caleb's foundation, Margaret found the ground not eroded but firmer when she pressed down with her boot heel, as if water had deposited mud rather than removed it. When she measured at houses without any deflection structures, the difference became stark. Peak water heights were comparable, but foundations under pillars were deeply hollowed in patches, mud swept clean, exposing voids that one more surge would tilt the posts. Flow there left clear swirl marks, dried mud circles etched around house bases. Margaret recorded everything in her notebook, with dates, times, and brief notes, no added emotion. To her, what mattered was not how the baffle wall looked, but which numbers it changed. When she shared the notebook with a few people in the area, the response was only shrugs. Some said the differences were too small to matter, that a few inches of water or a thicker mud layer proved nothing. Others said the water had not been strong enough, so any measure would seem effective. Earl Duvall heard it and laughed, saying numbers were nice, but the bayou does not read notebooks, and when water really got angry, those stakes would not stand long enough to measure. Margaret did not argue. She only knew those numbers were consistent and repeated at every point, that behind the baffle water was weaker, and foundation retained, while without it water was stronger, and foundation taken away. But in Bayou Sainte-Claire, beliefs did not change for a few notebook lines. Data could be correct, but it was not big enough yet to shake how people understood floods, and the cypress wall in front of Caleb's house, at least then, was still seen as an oddity surviving by luck more than physics. As water slowly receded after the first flood, Bayou Sainte-Claire left behind a thick mud layer, debris caught in branches, and the familiar damp earthy smell of ground freshly churned, then abandoned. Life quickly returned to its old rhythm, the way it always did after every rainy season. People rolled up sleeves to fix the most obvious damage, warped floorboards replaced, shifted steps rebuilt, exposed pillar bases packed with fresh mud and tamped tight. Everything done skillfully like a long-time habit, and no one thought about changing how their houses were built. Floods come every year, people said to each other, while standing on porches watching water retreat. This last one did not even reach the doortop. Those words quickly became the common conclusion that next time would be like before, that what stood once would keep standing. That familiar thinking led to wrong choices no one recognized. Then, some houses sealed wooden doors with thicker planks, nailed tighter to keep water out. Others piled heavy items against walls, placing cabinets, metal barrels, sandbags right inside to hold the house when water rose. They believed tighter and heavier meant safer, not understanding that those solid surfaces forced water to build pressure, turning the house into a rigid obstacle in the flow, where force had nowhere to dissipate and could only accumulate then break structure bit by bit. While neighbors busied with old habit repairs, Caleb Rourke barely touched his house. He replaced a few necessary planks, checked pillar bases for surety, then left everything as is. The only thing he spent time on was the Cypress Baffle wall in front. Caleb added diagonal stakes in sections where the recent flood swirled stronger than expected, reinforced ties that took heavy impacts, and extended the baffle's length downstream a few feet to catch deflected flow from farther. He also adjusted gaps between stakes based on how debris caught in water passed, widening here, tightening there, fine-tuning as if perfecting a tool just tested in real conditions. Those changes were small and hard to notice, but to Caleb they were most important, because he knew water never repeated exact movement twice. The quiet conflict lingered. Earl Duval passed by, looked at the stake row, and dropped a sarcastic remark that if water rose again that fence would be the first to float away. Caleb did not reply. He just drove another stake, adjusted another tie, then turned back to watch the bayou surface with the focus of someone who understood the most dangerous thing was not water, but misplaced human confidence in thinking they understood something just because it had not hurt them badly enough yet. Changes came slowly and quietly, but to someone used to watching water like Caleb they appeared clear and alarming. Bayou Sainte-Claire began changing color, no longer the familiar light brown after rain but shifting to darker, heavier, carrying thicker mud and tree fragments torn from upstream. Flow no longer moved evenly like a flat sheet but showed small swirls growing larger, slow turning deep circles signaling energy building rather than dispersing. Caleb noticed water rising faster than in previous rainy seasons, not in familiar inch-by-inch rhythm but in short abrupt jumps. Drifting debris was different too, no longer just dry branches and light weeds but large logs, empty barrels, even broken bridge pieces from somewhere farther. Standing near the Cypress Baffle wall, he heard water hitting stakes change sound, not steady murmur but deep heavy thuds as mass built force, then slid away, making stakes vibrate in ways they never had before. Those signs needed no numbers to prove, repeating enough to form a new pattern in an observer's eyes. From afar, news trickled in via radio and boaters' accounts, a storm system forming in the Gulf of Mexico, heavy rains no longer following familiar bayou cycles, upstream water volume potentially far above average. But in the community, that information was downplayed by their most recent experience. Many called it just season rain, like every other year, something they endured then patched up. A few cautious families left early, taking children and valuables to higher ground, but most stayed, minds still holding memory that their houses survived last time, that water would recede as always. That belief spread faster than flow, offering a sense of control in an unpredictable situation. Caleb argued with no one, tried to convince no one. He just spent more time by the baffle wall, walking its length, touching each stake, checking each tie, listening to how water slid through gaps. He understood that when water started behaving differently, old assumptions became dangerous. While the community saw the bayou surface and compared it to past rains, Caleb saw how energy was carried and distributed, changes in rhythm and sound only those living close to water long enough noticed, and the more small signs appeared, the more certain he was the real test had not started, that the first flood was only a gentle reminder, and what was coming would not care how lucky people had been in the past. The storm night arrived without giving anyone preparation time. Rain pouring down on Bayou Sainte-Claire as if the sky itself was torn open. No pauses, no breaks, just heavy sheets dumping straight onto the marsh and echoing back in deep roars in the darkness. Bayou water rose so fast, familiar measuring stakes vanished in hours, sweeping away illusions that people still had time to manage. Wind whipped across the surface, driving flow sideways into banks with force no one had witnessed before, and then everything began collapsing in the most chaotic way. Wooden steps tore off first, not from high flooding but from sideways current pressing, yanking then lifting whole sections, as if they were toys. Porch support posts hollowed at bases, as mud was continuously sucked away, snapping with cracks when footing was gone, and disappearing into murky water. Upstream debris no longer light fragments, but whole long heavy logs spinning like giant hammers, along with roof pieces, fences, barrels striking house walls with dry chilling thuds. In that chaos, Earl Duval's house became the disaster's center. Flow pressed hard against the front, nothing to slow or deflect, carving deep into ground under floors in short time. First floor sections collapsed while water was still waist low, creating black holes swallowing mud and swirling inward. Earl tried pulling belongings from the flow, but each turned back revealed another part of foundation gone, as if the bayou patiently coldly gnawed the house bite by bite. When children's cries rose from the back room, water had risen too fast to circle outside. 2 kids trapped on remaining floor, water coiling around table and chair legs, pulling hard enough adults clung to door frames to avoid falling. That was the moment everyone realized water did not just flood to occupy space but did something far more dangerous. It pushed then pulled back, creating swirls around every obstacle, pounding the same spot until it could not hold. No fixed safe direction, as flow shifted constantly with each carried object, each new opening. While many houses turned to floating wood piles in hours, the Cypress Baffle wall in front of Caleb Rourke's house stood as a strange shape amid the fury. First flow hitting stakes did not stop but slowed, torn into many small streams sliding through calculated gaps. Large logs caught outside, spinning a few turns then held long enough to lose momentum before sliding aside instead of slamming foundation. Behind the baffle, water still rose but no longer roared, mud settling instead of sucked away, ground holding shape longer than imaginable in such conditions. That difference lacked heroic spectacle. It was just relative quiet amid chaos, but that quiet saved the structure from the chain of relentless impacts destroying everything around. As night passed in unending rain, and cracking wood echoes from many directions, people began understanding this flood was unlike anything they previously called season rain. This was no longer water coming and going, but water carrying force to kill, to turn houses into temporary obstacles on its escape path, and to punish every human misunderstanding of how it worked. In that thick rainy night, as wood cracking and metal clanging echoed across the bayou, families began fleeing houses losing shape and following faint lights to Caleb Rourke's house. They arrived in chaos, mud to knees, water pulling back every step, carrying wrapped wet blanketed children and side-supported elders, gasping in heavy rain-smelling air. No one mentioned past laughter, as now only one question remained: how to survive the night. In front of Caleb's house, the Cypress Baffle wall appeared as a thick dark band in lightning flashes, and their flow showed the clearest difference. Water from the bayou rushed with same force as elsewhere, but hitting cypress stakes it did not concentrate on one solid face but split, dissipating into many small streams through prepared gaps. Large logs held outside, turning slowly in water, bumping each other then trapping, forming a rough effective barrier, making downstream fragments lose energy before traveling far. Flow redirected, sliding both sides of baffle instead of direct house strike, and behind the stakes water surface slightly lower, noticeably slower, deep swirls rarely forming long enough to carve ground. As people crossed the baffle to the porch, the difference felt almost unreal. Water roar softened to continuous low hum, no sudden yanks knocking people down. Inside the house, water still seeped through doors and cracks, rising to ankles then knees, but carried no tearing force. Foundation not hollowed, pillars steady, wood structure only lightly vibrating with flow rhythm instead of jerked from position. Caleb guided everyone to pre-planned spots, raising children and elders, distributing weight for even floor load, while outside water kept hitting baffle and having its rhythm broken. For hours, the stake row did exactly what it was built for, not as a heroic wall stopping nature, but as a patient intermediary absorbing, slowing, redirecting power seeking to destroy everything rigid in its path. Those sheltering in Caleb's house gradually realized their felt safety came not from water staying out, but from water lacking force for chain destruction. Children stopped crying when no longer yanked by current each movement. Elders breathed steadier when floor did not shake with impacts. And in dim oil lamplight people looked at each other in the silence of near-death escapes. Outside, many other houses kept collapsing through the night. But here amid mud and water, Caleb's house retained shelter shape, not by luck, but because a baffle wall did precisely what it was designed for: turn killing flow into bearable force, slow and dispersed enough for people inside to endure. While rain had not fully stopped and water still churned outside the baffle wall, Caleb Rourke did not let people sink into passive shelter too long, knowing his house could stand that night. But the whole community could not pin all hope on one spot. When water temporarily dropped enough for short, safe movement, Caleb began guiding able-bodied men outside to build temporary baffles for houses still salvageable. He spoke little, no long explanations, just pointed to available materials: stakes from broken fences, beams from collapsed sheds, old fishing nets, soaked but tough ropes. He told them drive stakes into mud in a deflecting row in front of houses, not perfectly straight, just solid enough not to topple immediately when pushed. Nets tied to stakes to catch large debris. Ropes crisscrossed so stakes did not separate under pull, and most importantly leave gaps between stakes even though instinct urged sealing every opening. Caleb repeated minimal principles in calm, short voice. Do not try blocking water, let it pass. Do not place straight in front of door, offset to bend flow direction. Do not make solid continuous surface because water will break it faster than anything. In flood night desperation, those words became the only order, and people followed not because they fully understood but because they had seen what happened without them. Caleb blamed no one for past laughter. No, I told you so. No smugness of being right. He just moved house to house in safe range, adjusting stake angles, tightening ropes, showing how to watch flow to know where to open more gaps, where to hold debris. Those temporary baffles were rough, ugly, uneven, but when water rose again, difference appeared almost immediately. At houses with baffles, front flow slower, mud settling instead of sucked away, large debris catching outside long enough to lose force before sliding aside. No house stayed dry, but foundations no longer carved minute by minute, remaining pillars gaining hours, sometimes whole nights, to stand. In scattered lightning, men who once called baffle wall odd now knelt in mud, tying ropes, hands shaking from cold and fatigue but minds unusually focused, each driven stake buying more time for their families. Caleb kept calm tone, not like a hero saving the world, but like a skilled craftsman passing essential actions in crisis. He understood the most important thing was not proving himself right, but helping as many as possible grasp one simple truth. Water taught that night, in the cruelest way. If people yield water a reasonable path, water takes less of what people cannot lose. When water finally retreated from Bayou Sainte-Claire, it revealed everything hidden during chaos, and the sight was heavier than any prior warning. Ground in front of many houses carved into long channels and bare swirl pits, mud sucked clean exposing roots and twisted foundation stakes. Houses once near the bank now tilted sideways or completely collapsed, leaving twisted frames and floor sections caught in downstream brush. Belongings scattered as silent evidence of wrong choices. Heavy wooden cabinets overturned, dented metal barrels, burst sandbags drifted far from where believed to hold houses. Amid that scene, Caleb Rourke's house still stood, not pristine or dry, but structure retaining original shape, foundation not hollowed, pillars straight and front Cypress Baffle walls still there, scratched, slightly bent in spots but no stake uprooted from mud. The contrast too clear to ignore. Past laughter no longer appeared, replaced by prolonged heavy silence as people walked among losses and remnants. Earl Duval stood long in front of Caleb's baffle wall, saying nothing first minutes, just looking at gaps, large logs still caught outside, then ground behind where mud settled into relatively stable plain. Finally he stepped closer and asked, not in familiar sarcastic tone, but hoarse from exhaustion and sleeplessness, how wide gaps between stakes should be. He asked which wood best resists water, how much to offset baffle from house face, why not seal tight even if it looks safer. Caleb answered each slowly, no more no less, no judgment, just what he observed, tried, and saw work in reality. Others began listening. No interruptions, no arguments, because around them was evidence needing no explanation. No one mentioned old mockery, no jokes about broken fence or useless cypress. Community attitude shifted quietly. No declarations or public apologies, shown only by people bringing tapes to measure, notebooks to record, and viewing the bayou with new caution. After the flood, atmosphere in Bayou Sainte-Claire changed in a hard-to-name way. Not joyful survival but belated choosing, when people realized nature had spoken clearly, and prior laughter only sign they had not listened. In days as mud gradually dried and large debris dragged to still solid ground, the story of Caleb Rourke's Cypress Baffle wall began spreading beyond Bayou Sainte-Claire in a way no one initiated, but everyone witnessed. People from nearby bayous boated over, not fleeting curiosity, but hearing that while many houses ruined, one still stood, with a stake row in front, unlike any considered flood protection. They studied the baffle wall, trying to decode a structure whose very simplicity made it hard to believe. The parish sheriff arrived one post-flood morning, bringing a county infrastructure official. No longer skeptical, they walked around the baffle, measuring each gap, tapping stakes, recording carefully as if surveying official work. They asked Caleb about stake driving depth, offset angle, why cypress chosen over cheaper, easier woods. Caleb answered briefly, practically, like someone only sharing observations proven by the recent flood. From those notes, an informal standardization began forming. Sheriff suggested remeasuring baffle at multiple points to compare post-flood foundation stability. County official noted 3 key parameters: stake spacing wide enough for water passage but blocking large debris, stake depth sufficient for lateral push resistance, baffle length extended along main flow angle, rather than just direct opposite house door. No one called it standard or code, but in the following week a few houses in neighboring bayous began driving first stake rows using exactly those numbers. Prior temporary baffles adjusted, stakes more staggered, nets tighter, some families using flood-carried logs as material as long as function deflected flow. What once seen as one quiet boat repairman's eccentric solution quietly became first step of a community method. No one asked if baffle was strong enough to block water, because now they knew it did not need to block, only guide water right. Local carpenters began discussing baffle improvements, rope or nails, where to add cross braces, how large gaps when forecast predicted heavy debris. A few elders long familiar with floods from their ancestors surprisingly recognized the let water find its way principle in native experience. Perfectly matched what Caleb did, only he turned it into fixed, scalable structure. The parish began considering including baffle walls in low bayou flood recommendations, not mandatory regulation, just official brief advice and seasonal reports. But that alone enough for many to change. What once odd solution now common practice, simple, buildable from available materials, and most importantly proven not by theory but by a flood that nearly killed the whole community. In that shift, no honors for Caleb, but every new stake row around the bayou carried his mark, a man who understood that to live with water sometimes the right thing is not fighting it, but helping it take the least damaging path. From those first stake rows, something more lasting than wood began forming around Bayou Sainte-Claire, collective memory of a man who understood water better than most who ever lived beside it. Caleb Rourke wrote no books, appeared in no major papers, stood before no community to lecture on his work. He just continued what he did before the flood, repairing boats, replacing planks, sitting on the dock watching flow and listening to small changes others missed. But in following years his silence spoke most. Rainy seasons passed, collapsed houses markedly decreased, places once deeply eroded now only lightly encroached, then self-deposited, because baffle walls deflected flow early enough water no longer struck foundations direct. Flood season deaths, once almost yearly, dropped, so parish reports noted, thanks to local flow dispersing structures, damage significantly reduced. No one needed asking what those structures were. Children growing up post-major flood began asking parents why every house had offset stake rows in front, and they heard about a flood that took much but also retaught a lesson. The community nearly forgot, water does not destroy because it is evil, but because people often force it to by standing in the wrong place. Caleb just aged with the bayou's years, walking slower, checking stakes, but eyes still sharp each time viewing water surface. Occasionally someone thanked him, but he only nodded as if unrelated to him, and continued measuring gaps with a short rope always in his shirt pocket. He never called what he did invention, never saw himself as pioneer. He only believed one simple thing: if you listen to water long enough, it tells you the way it wants to go. The community understood better than anyone. Caleb's legacy was not in cypress stakes, Wood eventually rots, needs replacing. But in a mindset shift, they no longer built houses like fortresses trying to resist something stronger, but like loose, flexible bridges, knowing how to reduce force rather than endure it. Later rainy seasons brought new floods, sometimes no less fierce than that year, but community preparation made outcomes vastly different. Water still rose, swirled, struck everything hard and sealed, but rarely met solid plains challenging it. Instead, it met stake rows allowing passage, slowing it, splitting it, making it lose destructive power before reaching where people lived. One parish official said in year-end report, "This year's damage low because community chose working with water rather than against it." And though Caleb's name not mentioned in official text, anyone reading knew the thought's origin. When Caleb passed, no monument erected, only new stake rows appearing after each rainy season, as the community's quiet way, remembering the man who helped them see the bayou differently. And for many years after, whenever newcomers to the area asked why St. Clair people built those strange offset baffles in front of houses, they often got the simple answer matching the man who created them. Because water does not need blocking, it just needs treating right. If you enjoy stories of practical wisdom and real-life survival lessons, please hit subscribe so you do not miss the next parts. Thank you for following. See you in the next journey.